Hello, I'm Father Bill Franklin, Associate Director of the American Academy in Rome, Italy, a professor at the Pontifical Angelicum University in Rome. I'm an Episcopal priest who is also academic fellow at the Anglican Center in Rome, and I'm joined today by Dr. Christopher Wells, who currently lives in Dallas, Texas. So, Christopher, perhaps you could introduce yourself.
Hello, Father Bill. Thank you for that brief introduction. I'm Christopher Wells, and I just finished my PhD work in theology at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, and I've just accepted a position as Executive Director of the Living Church Foundation, which publishes the Living Church magazine and is based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I'm a Deputy to General Convention of the Episcopal Church, and I'm delighted to be in this conversation today.
Well, Dr. Wells, I think it's an awesome moment to start your career leading the Living Church, a moment in Anglicanism. On December the 4th, the New York Times published on its front page, actually above the fold, a news story about the formation of a new denomination in the United States, the Anglican Church of North America. Right. On December 3rd, a group of former Episcopal bishops announced the creation of this new Anglican group for Canadians, people from the United States, and Mexicans. I was surprised that the New York Times gave such attention to this story. Mm-hmm. Basically, a small group of people, 4 former dioceses of the Episcopal Church deciding to break away from the Episcopal Church and form a new Christian group. Now, you could say, well, it is an important story whenever there's yet another fracture of the body of Christ. It is an important story whenever people go into schism. And yet, I'm surprised that the Times gave it so much attention. Mm-hmm. So, from your perspective, could you comment on your view of the significance of this move on the part of these people breaking away from the Episcopal Church? Is this a theological movement? Is it a cultural movement? Will it wither away? Or do you think it's something that mainline Anglicans should be paying attention to at this moment?
Perhaps all of the above. I mean, those are great questions. It might wither away, and I also think that it's something we should pay attention to. I have to say, I mean, there was a piece of me that grimaced at the coverage by the New York Times and a number of other newspapers, just insofar as the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion seems bent on continually, embarrassing itself these days in the press and sort of airing our dirty laundry out in public. But perhaps there's something to be said for having having disputes with ourselves in an open and sort of candid manner. And certainly other churches, I think of the Roman Catholic Church, for example, tends to have political debates more sort of in private. So perhaps this is a strange kind of virtue of Anglicanism, that in our sort of weakness and divisions that we nonetheless, perhaps I think we have an opportunity to model sort of how Christians might disagree with one another charitably. The New York Times has covered, and a number of other newspapers have covered the kind of continual political fracturing and arguing about, same-sex blessings and so forth for a number of years. So in that sense, I wasn't surprised.
But, Dr. Wells, but it surprises me that the Times placed the whole focus of its coverage of this story on the election of an openly gay bishop in New Hampshire 5 years ago. Right. And that, in fact, it's the issue of sexuality that lies at the basis of this schism. And maybe that is a story. Maybe that is something new, because what has impressed me about the history of Anglicanism is that throughout its history, for 450 years, Anglicans have been able to contain disagreement within one body. And I think the Episcopal Church, when it separated itself from the Church of England in the 18th century, prided itself on creating one national church that was able to combine all the regions of the United States, black people, white people, and a whole variety of disagreements, and that the Episcopal Church in its structures survived great divisions in the United States. The Episcopal Church survived the division over slavery. The Episcopal Church survived the growth of a strong Anglo-Catholic party and a strong evangelical party in one body. So why do you think now this one issue of human sexuality has split our church in the sense that this minority of dioceses has broken away and said they're going to form a new body?
Right.
Is this a theological issue? Or is in fact this really cultural politics? Is this really playing out on the church stage the culture wars that we've seen to dominate American political life for the last 16 years?
Well, I mean, I think there is an aspect to this, a sort of culture wars aspect of this. And I think to some extent, I mean, it's been shown that some of the sort of conservative dissatisfaction throughout the communion is a result of sort of exporting American culture wars perspectives, to Africa and so forth. But I think a sort of certain geopolitical analysis of this makes sense insofar as, the American, empire or whatever we would like to call the current United States sort of, political reality is often perceived as, well, a mixed blessing on the international stage. And, the American churches moving ahead with same-sex blessings and so forth in 2003 is often perceived to be a sort of unilateralist parallel to the war in Iraq, for example. And even though that would be sort of abhorrent to progressives in the Episcopal Church.
Christopher, so you're making the point that there's been a cultural arrogance of the Episcopal Church, a kind of a liberal arrogance in which the Episcopal Church has been almost parallel to the arrogance of George W. Bush, now leaving office. But couldn't I argue that, in fact, the election of the first openly gay bishop in New Hampshire in 2003, first of all, followed the polity of the Episcopal Church exactly, and the Episcopal Church didn't diverge from its polity at all in that, and that this decision was in line with a number of developments in which the structures and the possibility of participating in ordained ministry were opening up to wider and wider people. In 1804, the Episcopal Church, for the first time, ordained an African American as a priest. In 1974, irregularly, but in 1976, the Episcopal Church began to ordain women as priests. In 1988, it consecrated the first woman as a bishop. So that the Episcopal Church would say it's been embracing a cultural dynamic of gradual liberation of minorities. And that what happened in this case, how could such a development possibly allow one group to say, we're going to take our diocese out of the Episcopal Church and form a whole new separate... What is so disagreeable in this action about electing a gay bishop that would allow this split to take place?
I mean, I think, Father Bill, we have to put this in a context of all the recent discussion among the Anglicans about how we should structure our church and the fundamental reforms that are happening in the communion right now, which I think are very exciting.
And what would those be?
Which were sort of, the whole process of international consultation and reordering of our communion that has sort of began after the 2003 General Convention with the election of Gene Robinson. So we have the publishing of the Windsor Report in 2004, 1 year later, which essentially kind of lays out a roadmap for Anglican reform. And it's interesting that they set aside the issue of sexuality, and they said actually, well, there is a sort of agreed upon teaching that we have in the communion on this. So they just simply reported that conclusion, and they quoted the Archbishop of Canterbury and primates and Lambeth resolutions to that end. And then they said, but this is an interesting opportunity for Anglicans to kind of begin to get our house in order and to face the question of authority, which has been, essentially the problem of all Christians in the West since the 16th century. Either sort of, I would say, in broad brushstrokes, the Protestant problem is not knowing who's in charge, if you will, and suffering from a sort of, a certain messiness, but we at least have freedom. And then on the Catholic side, perhaps being very certain who's in charge, but worrying a little bit about freedom of conscience and so forth. But so I think we need to separate two issues. One is there's an ecclesiological discussion, that's to say a discussion about the nature of the church, how the church should be ordered, and the ecumenical vocation of Anglicanism and authority questions and all of this. And then questions about teaching and sexuality. And I think this conservative departure now in the beginning of the Anglican Church in North America with these 4 dioceses has to be mapped relative to all of those issues. And it also has to be mapped relative to more fundamental theological issues that they view themselves as disagreeing on with the Episcopal Church.
But, Dr. Wells, I would disagree with you on this point to say that this announcement on December 3rd is basically an undercutting of the Windsor process that you pointed out. The Windsor process was a process initiated by the Archbishop of Canterbury to keep people in one structure, to keep people in one conversation. The strength of Anglicanism has been to allow people to disagree and stay a part of a structure. And now these bishops have really broken that compact. And in fact, they are pulling the rug out from the Archbishop of Canterbury by saying, okay, we're going to go our own way.
Well, arguably, that's arguably the case.
I see this a kind of cultural imperialism on the part of these 4 dioceses to say, okay, we American dioceses really don't care about the process that the Archbishop of Canterbury has set in place. So the way they have treated the Episcopal Church by saying we're going to pick up our marbles and walk, they're also saying to the Archbishop. And I think they claim to be a part of a Catholic understanding of the Christian faith. But I think to go your own way, to be schismatic, to claim to be a new Reformation, is actually to be betraying the Catholic heritage of the Church. So what good can you say about these dioceses and the movement that they've taken? They seem to have made a mockery of all that has been done in the last 5 years to try to keep a conversation going.
Well, I mean, I think we have to be honest about a sort of fundamental disorder throughout the communion. And there's been lots of bad behavior and sort of violations of, the proposed Windsor sort of restructuring and reordering of the church since 2004. So, I mean, if we're going to accuse these conservative dissidents of being imperialists, I mean, they certainly perceive the American Episcopal Church, in its leadership to be continuously and ongoingly and unrepentantly imperialist as well.
But is that a fair accusation?
There's a kind of tit-for-tat imperialism here, and perhaps the people on the far left and the people on the far right have a sort of mirror image American unilateralist habit of acting. I mean, that's sort of my view. I do think we could concede that this departure is not actually in step with a sort of traditional Catholic order, arguably. But, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, Catholic order has sort of been an endangered species in the Anglican Communion, and certainly in sort of Episcopalian circles for quite a while. I mean, any number of dioceses in the Episcopal Church, for example, are in their current diocesan conventions voting to overturn even the most spare affirmations of the Windsor moratoria. So the resolution at the last General Convention, which just barely passed by a hair's breadth at the end with special pleading of the presiding bishop, Resolution B033, which essentially instituted a moratorium on the further elections of gay bishops. This is one of the basic talking points for many dioceses in the Episcopal Church coming into the General Convention this summer, that we need to overturn that resolution. And so at recent conventions, Atlanta and California and so forth have overturned that, even against the advice of the presiding bishop. So,
but isn't, in fact, wouldn't you say that this development announced on December 3rd in Wheaton, Illinois, is also breaking one of the moratoria asked for by the Lambeth Conference?
I think it is. I think it is, so that, Bill, but I think we need to be honest with ourselves about a problem that we have throughout the communion right now, which is basic disorder And my hope is the Archbishop of Canterbury's hope, as far as I understand, as far as I know still, which is the hope of the Windsor process and a covenant process. But that's going to entail a kind of new commitment to mutual accountability and shared life and patience with one another. And here's where the Catholic problem, I think we have to be honest about it, that it's not simply the Anglican Church in North America or 4 dissident dioceses, because they're taking protection under the Church of the province of the Southern Cone. And apparently some primates immediately came out, head bishops of independent Anglican churches immediately came out and said, we approve of this, we will give our blessing. And, there's a movement among some of the more conservative primates in Africa and elsewhere to, put the force of their office and organizing energies and everything behind the new province, and I think ultimately a realignment of Anglicanism. And at that point, if we're listening carefully to our conservative friends, and I consider myself a conservative, but I mean these people are a little bit to the right of me, at least ecclesiologically. If we're listening carefully, I think sometimes they talk about a new Anglican communion that's post Canterbury. And so it's not ordered around the office of the Archbishop of Canterbury anymore. That, to me, is sort of ecumenically anathema and would be sort of the failure of Anglicanism. But my point is, it's not just American dissidents, and we need to be honest about fundamental dysfunction throughout the whole communion on this point. And this is above both of our pay grades, but as far as I can tell, the Archbishop of Canterbury is having a very hard time keeping all the primates on one page, even.
But would you say that those who have left have any cause for complaint about the Episcopal Church? I mean, do they have, as former American Episcopalians, a grievance which justifies taking this very serious step of schism?
Yeah.
Schism in the sense of breaking with your parent body, taking diocese out of your parent body.
Well, it's arguably two things. Just one clarification. I mean, I think we have to say it's only arguably schism, Bill, because they are moving within the communion. If they had simply started a new church all on their own and said this is the true Episcopal Church or something, but without working within the larger communion dynamics and trying to get the blessings of primates and so forth as they've done, then I think we could say this is just like the Reformed Episcopal Schism at the end of the 19th century or something like that.
But you are projecting
and it's
that
also,
Anglicanism...
ironically, paradoxically, kind of a movement of Christian unity of sort of vociferous separated Anglicans, because it involves the Common Cause coalition of sort of like 9 erstwhile departed bodies, including the Reformed Episcopal Church. So it's kind of oddly ecumenical in a way.
But these are tiny little minuscule fragmented bodies,
Sure.
which is sort of ecumenism of the dwarfs, I would say.
Right.
Whereas a major symbolic split has occurred, which seems to me to challenge the whole Catholic nature of the Church, which doesn't represent Christian unity at all. And I think it's fair to say, from someone who lives in Rome, who is fairly close to the views of what the Holy See is saying about this, I think throughout this whole debate, the Holy See has made a point of wanting to protect and defend the basic unity of the Anglican Communion, and protect and defend the point of view of the Archbishop of Canterbury as the focus of unity. And so I see that this, again, in some ways is a challenge also to the position that the Holy See has taken in this whole debate.
Well,
that,
I think
that an important...
If I could just say, I mean, to answer your earlier question, about grievances, I think that there are plenty of grievances to go around on all sides. And I actually
name some. I need to hear what some of their grievances are.
Say again?
I need to hear what some of their grievances are.
Well, I mean, you asked whether or not the grievances sort of amount to a justification for a departure.
Yes.
And I have to say, in my view, they don't. But that doesn't mean that they don't have legitimate grievances. And I do think that the Episcopal Church in its sort of, central authorities and so forth. And I think especially the presiding bishop and the president of the House of Deputies and, the chancellor, the presiding bishop's chancellor, have acted in a fairly draconian manner. And you don't have to be a kind of right-wing conservative or super conservative to believe this, The very charitable, middle-of-the-road bishop, Ed Little from northern Indiana has talked about, the depositions of bishops. Bishop Duncan, who's the former bishop, I guess, or bishop, depending on your view, of Pittsburgh, one of the dioceses that have just left, they deposed him. They deposed John David Schofield of San Joaquin. And Bishop Little calls this the ecclesiastical equivalent of the death penalty. It's thoroughly lacking in charity. What it does is it sort of pushes them out the door and says, and stay out, and it seems to cut off the possibility of reconciliation. And I think, in a sense, we almost sort of come to a kind of Palestine versus Israel situation here, where each side remembers the latest grievance and simply recounts its own history of grievances without sort of facing the sin of its own culpability, its own, so there's been a kind of bullying nature. I mean, I also think that these conservatives are rightly concerned about the theological orientation of many of the bishops. They worry about, they wonder if they can recognize the fullness of the Christian faith when the presiding bishop speaks. I don't think it's charitable to kind of run around and call her a heretic all the time. But I also don't think it's inappropriate to press her on questions of Christology or authority of Scripture and to have more robust theological debates than we've been able to have.
Yeah. Well, I disagree with this because I think you have articulated that this is schism because of grievance. I don't think they've made the case that this is schism because of a theological perspective on which they fundamentally disagree with the Episcopal Church. And they've claimed the word Reformation for what they've done. Right. I think this is a bogus claim. Mm-hmm. I see no Luther out there. I see the Reformation as having a theological perspective, carefully and brilliantly articulated, which caused it to find a theological basis for its critique of problems within the larger Catholic Church, and on the basis of that critique lead to separation. I find no theological articulation in these dioceses that fundamentally allows them to claim the need to separate from the Episcopal Church.
Well,
rather, I see a cultural list of grievances, which I would argue with you is basically based not on theology at all, but on a cultural war scenario in the United States. So that you have basically played out on the ecclesial battlefield a parallel to what you had played out on the American political battlefield. And to say that, and somehow the Episcopal Church is not claiming the Catholic faith, when at every Eucharist we recite the Nicene Creed, mm-hmm. we have not departed from the fundamentals of Christian theology and our liturgy and what we believe. We have not denied the 4 points of the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral. Mm-hmm. So all the fundamental positions of our church, on what basis is this Reformation being espoused except a cultural war basis, which comes back to the New York Times headline, which is the question of an openly gay bishop cause for a split within Christianity?
Well, I understand what you're saying, and I think that there's a certain reasonable pattern of argument there, and it's certainly a familiar one. The problem, Bill, I do think cultural dynamics are involved, so I agree with you so far as that goes. The problem is I think it's reductive. There is a fundamental and long-standing theological disagreement about many of these things, and conservatives themselves are divided in the United States about how to proceed relative to the Episcopal Church. I think it has to be said, and it has to be said with zeal and conviction, and often, that the majority of conservatives in the Episcopal Church, at least at the moment, and certainly dioceses that are self-identify that way, have remained in the Episcopal Church. So there's a coalition of, it used to be called the Windsor Bishops, but now it's called the Communion Partners. There are 14 dioceses that are identified with the Communion Partners who are theologically conservative, and by that is meant in step with the wider communion, in step with the Archbishop of Canterbury, taking seriously the Windsor Report, committed to it. So I think there is a substantive theological debate going on here, and it's one that has to be cultivated.
But what is
and then
it?
we need to be
You have to
serious
name it.
about the theological and scriptural and then ecclesiological implications of our disagreements about sexuality. And that's what the Windsor Report did. So if we make it simply about, these bigots who can't stand a gay bishop, then I think we're not wrestling with the larger debate that's happening within Anglicanism right now, which is a very creative debate.
I did not use the word bigots.
Oh, right. No, I know you didn't.
I didn't use the word bigot. But I was saying that, but I think that the Times article was symbolic in leading the story in a sub-headline, is that was the issue of the break.
Right.
And the question that I am saying is that it seems to me, is not a theologically divisive issue in the sense of a parallel issue to the Reformation. So where is the new Reformation? Or isn't this, in fact, a false claiming of this noble word Reformation for a movement which seems to be something of a power grab by a group of disgruntled bishops and dioceses?
Right.
I think it's important that you have said there are 14 dioceses who are more conservative, who've remained within the Episcopal Church, who are staying a part of the dialogue. This seems to me to be the Anglican way.
Right.
This seems to be what the Archbishop of Canterbury has been calling for. This is what we thought was achieved by the Lambeth Conference of this past summer.
Right.
Of a moderately successful conference, which kept the Episcopal Church within the larger Anglican communion, which asked the Episcopal Church to continue a moratorium on future gay bishops and diocesan authorized rights for same-sex blessings. And in fact, am I not correct that since 2003, no openly gay bishop has been elected in the Episcopal Church? So,
except
up to this point,
same-sex blessings continue apace in a number of places. The Diocese of Los Angeles just made some decision, I believe, to approve them now officially, or for them to go on. And that was the convention where the presiding bishop was present and observant, as I understand.
But I think the symbolic thing that the Times led with, another gay bishop, that has not happened. And there seems to be a willingness on the part of the Episcopal Church to hold that line, if I may use that word. So why did these 4 dioceses and these other bishops use this moment to undercut the Archbishop of Canterbury and to undercut this process of reconciliation?
Well,
other than for it seems to me, dishonorable reasons. I cannot find your argument convincing at all that this is a justifiable split.
I didn't actually say it was justifiable. I said I don't believe it is.
Well, that's good.
But I think that, Bill, I think to understand what this issue is, and if we're going to sort of learn from it, and why is this interesting? Why is it important for all Anglicans? Why is it important for all Episcopalians, including ones who have who share much in common and then have some disagreements as well, like you and me probably. And I think we have to put it in the larger context of a dramatic struggle for the identity of Anglicanism. What does it mean for the Anglican communion to have an ambition to be Catholic, for example? The Windsor Report, I did a word study on this. They used the word. I did a word study on when they used the word Protestant and when they used the word Catholic, and they used the word Protestant at one moment in the report simply to note, sort of disinterestedly, that the Anglican tradition has always claimed at once to be have Catholic and Protestant elements, and then they go on to use the word Catholic like 6 or 8 or 10 times throughout the thing. And then, if we're mapping sort of the Archbishop of Canterbury's orienting writings in the last 5 or 6 years, he's continually talked about, the Anglican communion becoming more Catholic. And then our Roman Catholic friends, as you know, have continually watched, monitored, but also intervened, made comments, written substantive responses to things. Walter Casper from the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity wrote a very substantial response to the Windsor Report, and he said, we love the Catholic direction of this, and we note that you want to be Catholics. We also would like to see you talk more about apostolicity and apostolic doctrine. So it was a sort of good, well done, but come further, and an encouragement. And I think this is the larger dynamic. And actually, we will capitulate to the American culture wars ourselves, including in this very conversation, if we simply make it about the Episcopal Church versus the conservative dissidents who've left.
But I am arguing in this conversation that the founders of this breakaway group have basically capitulated to aspects of American culture in this. This breaking of groups, the Northern Baptists from the Southern Baptists, the Northern Methodists from the Southern Methodists. This has been a characteristic of American history, which we've seen played out in our own time over this cultural issue. Whereas I think that there's a fundamental Anglican understanding of Catholicity that for our Episcopal Church has been expressed in the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, which say that there are 4 things that it takes to be a Catholic Church. The Holy Scripture, the creeds, the sacraments, and the historic episcopate. And we believe that the historic episcopate has been a sign of the apostolic continuity in our church. And until this point, we have felt that our American body as a whole, within those 4 pillars of Catholicity, can contain a wide disagreement over all sorts of matters. The nature of the Holy Eucharist itself, the actual theology of the historic episcopate, people have disagreed about that. But they have remained in communion because they have been allied to these 4 principles. Now, what has happened in the last 5 years that make people fear that our church somehow has lost those 4 fundamental principles? That's what I would like you to tell me, that the Wheaton, Illinois dissidents have defined some perspective on Catholicity.
I don't think they have. I think that they are the polar opposite of the sort of schismatic sort of go it my own way kind of an approach that has been on the left.
But you're trying to tell me that the Episcopal Church needs to do something.
I do.
I
think the Episcopal Church.
What is it? What is it?
At this point, Bill, I think that what needs to happen is we need to be honest. Like I said, I mean, if we think about this sort of on an analogy to the Israel-Palestine situation or something, kind of long since aggravated, agons, with just many rounds of offense and hurt feelings, and I'm outraged that you said that and all this. And it's just been, layering on for months and years, and to some extent in simmering for decades in certain circles. So we all need to take responsibility for our own actions. And I think here is what a charitable perspective would be from the perspective of the Episcopal Church with relative to these people. It would say, first of all, we did aggravate them. We did often provoke them. We shouldn't have thrown so many lawsuits at them. They may have sued us as well, or in some cases they actually begged us not to sue them. But this also was one of the requests of the primates in the Windsor Report. So ratchet down the anger, ratchet down the sort of mean-spirited canon legal, approaches to these things. Secondly, recognize that the whole Anglican communion is hanging in the balance of all this, because it's unfortunately not just 4 dissident dioceses. It's 4 dissident dioceses working with primates throughout the communion, and in a sense, the global South, the majority of the global South, which is 2/3 of the Anglican people in the pews, is hanging in the balance here. And so the Episcopal Church needs to be very wise and humble and recognize that there's this larger structural dynamic and that sort of the future of Anglicanism is in the balance. And then thirdly, I think the Episcopal Church therefore needs to be serious about facing into a covenant. What could it mean for the Anglican communion to move in a covenanted direction? And the Archbishop of Canterbury has put the entire force of his office behind this, as you know. And he continually referred to it in all 3 of his presidential addresses at the Lambeth Conference.
But why should we... I just defined a covenant that we already have, which is the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral. We have this definition of the fundamental elements of Anglicanism, which have kept this diverse communion together for 450 years.
Yeah.
Why do we need something new? I mean, how does this crisis, admittedly, over the gay bishop of New Hampshire, why does this one issue require some covenant that is more expanded than the Chicago Quadrilateral, which has served us so well for so long?
Well,
this sounds like an innovation. This sounds like something new. And how could you possibly justify this new thing?
Well, look, in some sense, I'm nostalgic for the days when we didn't need this either. But I think that if we're honest, Bill, we would have to say that the divisions have advanced at such a pace at this point that we have to have something like this. But I would say two things, and that's what the Archbishop of Canterbury has said, what I just said. But the first thing is that the Covenant Design Group itself and the Windsor Report, which proposed to this, has argued that this is actually a conservative, that's to say non-innovative, kind of traditional thing, and that growing out of covenant dynamics that have always been there. And the quadrilateral might be one piece of it. But this ambition to be a communion, to be accountable to one another, and there are any number of ways of making the point. But the Virginia Report in 1997 sort of initially made the argument. And, here's the challenge. I mean, if we are not actually consulting one another and living lives of mutual subjection when we have disagreements, like about sexuality. But if not sexuality, maybe lay presidency at the Eucharist next year or now. And so what the Windsor Report proposed, and then the Covenant is advancing, is that if we have this weird sort of Anglican proposal, attempt to do something called, autonomy in communion, or communion as the limit of autonomy or something, then what we need to do is hold together in a meaningful sense of having autonomous churches in the communion with their own canon law and so forth, and a certain amount of freedom on the one hand, but a genuine relationship of accountability on the other, which means that when we have disagreements, we will act with diligence, care, and caution before taking actions that could threaten the unity of the communion or the credibility of its mission. That's what the Covenant Design Group said in its last draft. So I think that's sort of where the rubber hits the road for the Episcopal Church or the Diocese of Sydney. Is are we willing to act with diligence and, care and caution before taking actions that could threaten our unity?
But I think the strength of Anglicanism has been that it has been able to basically be a national reflection of the Anglican ethos, an ethos that's been able to be embodied in an authentic way in each national spirit, in the liturgy of each national church,
sure,
the canon law of each national church. What I fear about this covenant debate that you're raising now is that ultimately the Episcopal Church might not be able to go along with this covenant.
Right.
So that in effect, that the Episcopal Church, by holding to the quadrilateral rather than the new covenant, because the Episcopal Church has never disagreed with the quadrilateral, the Episcopal Church might be standing for a more classical kind of Anglicanism, and the covenant represents a new Anglicanism, something that is really a new development, very much spurred by a response to this crisis and to the wishes of the third world.
Well,
and so that ultimately the covenant itself is becoming a divisive thing. I mean, the covenant, I fear, if this covenant would come on the floor of our General Convention, at which you will be a delegate next summer, this could be yet another divisive hatchet rather than a means of creating unity within the communion, which is really the call for the moment. So I wonder, at your ending the conversation today in talking about the covenant as a solution, rather I'm arguing that for the relation of the Episcopal Church to the larger communion, the covenant might be a negative.
I understand the concern, and it's commonly articulated. But I think the alternative, Bill, is the end of the Anglican communion. I mean, we have major division and disintegration already. And if the Episcopal Church would turn down a covenant at a vote at the General Convention this summer, then we need to ask ourselves why. what in the covenant is so offensive? The Covenant Design Group published a document this October that was a response to the bishops at the Lambeth Conference, and it's called a Lambeth Commentary. And they have sort of Q&A in response to the questions of the bishops and so forth. And one of the things they do is they tabulate the responses. And, the covenant draft has 3 sections in it. And the first 2 are pretty uncontroversial. And over 90% of the bishops present, including the majority of the Episcopal Church's bishops, had no problem with those sections. But they set down the theological basis that then points toward the third. And it's the third section, as you know, that many Episcopalian bishops balk at, many of our own bishops.
Exactly.
But if we're tabulating the responses in terms of numbers of provinces, relative, how many provinces or churches of the communion, how did they respond? How can their responses be mapped relative to the third section? The Covenant Design Group says 2/3 to 3/4 of the Anglican communion provinces have no problem with the third part. So that puts the progressive or minority or the people who are worried or whatever about this further accountability in a significant minority. And at that point, I think we would need to ask ourselves, is the covenant an instrument of division or of potential unity? Without a covenant, the Archbishop of Canterbury has said, I could just, quote, he says, in his second presidential address at Lambeth, we need to speak life to each other, and that means change. So he's agreeing with you there. In a sense, this is a change, a development. He says, I've made no secret of what I think that change should be, a covenant that recognizes the need to grow towards each other and also recognizes that not all may choose that way. He says, I find it hard at present to see another way forward that would avoid further disintegration.
Well, I would like to bring the conversation toward the last section here by saying that as an American who lives in Rome and has lived here now for almost 4 years, I have a certain pride in the fact of our recent presidential election, that we took this step of embracing for the first time an African American as our president,
right.
And how the world was really inspired by that, as once again the United States taking a stand for the unity of the human race, for the progress of the human race, and that our country, in so many ways, at its best, is a country of idealism, founded on religious idealism, and that the movement for Christian unity in the United States really got its start after the American Civil War, when Christians were scandalized by their own divisions into these little tiny churches when our nation had come back together. And here we're having this conversation at the end of 2008. We have this inspiring example in our political life, and then we have what is to me a shocking example in our church life of this headline in the Times, which announces this schism. And so as a Christian, I find this development seems to me to be the counter to the will of Jesus, that the will of Jesus is to the unity of the people of Jesus. And that every effort should be made to build that unity up. And I see that the Archbishop of Canterbury, the way the Vatican has supported him, has been in the direction of this maintenance of unity at all costs. And that this development comes as really a counter negative move to the hopeful signs of the times. And I'm wondering what you would say as a more conservative spokesman of the Episcopal Church about how you, as a Christian, match this negative development with the more hopeful signs of American political life.
Well, I think that's very creative on your part, and I think you're right. And I myself found much to be hopeful about in the election of Barack Obama. And I agree. We have to tell that story about the origins of the ecumenical movement here and remember American idealism. And this is why, again, I think, in a sense, the armies need to stand down on all sides. And that includes the armies of 815, and the presiding bishop and her lawyers and lawsuits. And if we want to fight for the Anglican communion, it has to be creative. It also has to be substantial. It's going to take sacrifice. And I think we need to, fight for the will of the majority. So I agree with the Archbishop of Canterbury that this is a hopeful opportunity, I think, with a covenanted communion, to gather the optimism and the creative spirit of the ecumenical movement. And I think we have to also, I think this is why our Roman Catholic friends are looking with great interest on the covenant process, because if we look at the drafts of the covenant that are being, the second draft, which is available now, has been around for months, I think it has a kind of ecumenical creativity and flexibility in it, which is just a wonderful promise. So I think we have to view this general movement towards unity in the communion around Canterbury, around Windsor Principles, around a covenant, as sort of the best game in town, as Oliver O'Donovan said. And I think sort of the alternative is division, and not simply a departure for conservative dioceses, but a separation of the majority of Anglicans from Canterbury, a separation of the majority of Anglicans from the Episcopal Church. And in the end, I think then that would be the failure of the Anglican communion.
I would say that in this conversation, I've been the actual conservative, because I've been arguing that if we let the Episcopal Church and its tradition of debate and inclusivity within the broad parameters of the quadrilateral, if we would just let that system work, which I believe embodies the idealism of the American spirit, if we could let that work effectively and embrace both the liberals and conservatives, then we would go a long way toward healing the divisions within our own church. But that this drastic action is the worst possible response to the situation that you and I have defined today. And therefore, my hope is that these dissidents would return and let the system actually work.
And I just think that the Episcopal Church needs to, face into the possibility that it also has been a dissident in the communion in some respects,
Okay.
And rise to the terms of the wider communion's discussion. But I don't disagree with you that the Anglican Church in North America is not the way to go.
But we have had two different perspectives on this current situation, and I thank you very much for joining me in this conversation.
Thank you, Father Bill. It's been a great honor and a delight. I always love talking to you.
Thank you, Dr. Wells, and good luck with the Living Church.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.